Okay, so yeah, welcome to this session, which is the first session of the Narratives of Illness and Disability in Scottish Literature webinar series, and welcome to all of you who have managed to join this call, and also thanks to those of you who are watching the recording later on. So I will start by introducing. I will start by saying a couple of words about this webinar series, and today is the first session, and we are really lucky to start with the presentation by two wonderful speakers, Holly Nelson and Graham Morgan. And I will introduce Holly and Graham in a second. And it's really amazing to start with these two presentations. So before, it says Leo, that's amazing.
I'll let people in so you don't have to worry about it.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much. Hi, Ainsley. Welcome. We've just started. I was just saying welcome to everyone to this first session of the webinar series of Narratives of Illness and Disability in Scottish Literature. I will say, yes, a couple of words. Sorry, I have a script. Yes, this webinar series is supported by the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literature, and it is the first project of a newly formed working group that we've called Disability and Scottish Studies Working Group. And there are all of us in the working group are present, so it's Holly, John, Claudia, Ainsley, and Struan. So, and they are in the call, so hopefully you will be able to see them. And should you be interested in joining us, or if you know someone who might be interested, please reach out to any of us in the call or to IASL, and they will put you in touch with us. Yes, so as a working group, just a couple of words. Our hope is to encourage engagement with narratives of illness and disability in cross-period Scottish literature and culture. And we also want to create a space for community building and support, where we explore the richness of narratives of illness and disability, whether contemporary, for example, Graham's memoirs, or more historical. And Holly is going to present on that today. So, so please join us in organizing or in presenting or in just being part of this new community we're trying to create. Now going to our first presentations and speakers. This first session is very exciting. It's devoted to autobiographies from very different points in time. So we will start with Holly Nelson, who is going to present her paper titled Writing the Gendered Working Class Disabled Self, a Glaswegian Woman's Fight for Justice in Victorian Scotland. And Holly is Professor of English and co-director of the Gender Studies Institute, as well as the graduate stream coordinator of the MA in Interdisciplinary Humanities program at Trinity Western University, Langley, BC, Canada. She's also secretary of the James Hogg Society and editor of Studies in Hogg and His Word. She has widely published on Scottish, Welsh, and English literature of the long 18th and 19th centuries, and her publications include a monograph co-authored with Sharon Alker, titled Besieged, Early Modern British Literature, 1642-1722, and 11 co-edited volumes, most notably James Hogg, Literary Marketplace, Scottish Romanticism, and the Working Class Author from Ashgate, and also Robert Burns and Transatlantic Culture. Holly has taught disability and literature at the graduate level and has written several articles and book chapters on the subject matter, most recently in relation to a novel by John Gould. She was born in Ayrshire in Scotland, grew up in Edinburgh before her family immigrated to the west coast of Canada. So before further ado, Holly, please take it away. And yes, you're
All
sharing.
right.
So
So you
that's
can
amazing.
now when I change the slide, let me see
Mm,
if you guys can see it. So does it change when I do that? Oh, wonderful. A
yes,
miracle.
wonderful. Yes.
All right. So this talk is based on research I carried out with Dana Graham Lai, my former graduate student and current PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University. It was Dana who actually first drew my attention to Elizabeth Story's work and who wrote a research paper on aspects of it. So we then dove into it together and to expand our understanding of what Story was trying to do with her life story. And so this, I'm speaking really on behalf of Dana and me. The subject matter of disability and working class Victorian Scottish woman has personal meaning for me as well, and for Sharon Alker, who's joining us today. Our own maternal grandmother, Agnes Fleming MacDonald Dunn, was a Victorian Glaswegian woman born in 1888 who left school at the age of 11 to work in a local factory before training as a seamstress and later as a midwife and then a nurse who cared for soldiers injured in World War One. Grandma Dunn, you can see her beside me as a teenager when I was young and beautiful and slim. Grandma Dunn lived with my family until she died at the age of 94. And when Sharon and I knew her, she was disabled, having lost a leg due to complications from diabetes. So that's one of the reasons I was kind of drawn to the work of Elizabeth Story. When I began to read the autobiography of Elizabeth Story, a native of Glasgow who was subjected to much injustice at the hands of some members of the medical, legal, and clerical professions, published in 1859, I was immediately struck by her extensive lifelong experience with a trifecta of professionals, doctors, lawyers, and church leaders. However, I was surprised that such a work existed, given that it is rare for a disabled working class Victorian woman in Scotland to publish an autobiographical work. If it were not for the dedicated research of Florence S. Booth, authors of Memoir of Victorian Working Class Woman, The Hard Way Up, we might still know little about the works that were published by such women in general or about Elizabeth's story in specific. Born in Glasgow in 1818 to a cotton weaver and a cotton winder, Story was a victim of medical malpractice of the most severe kind. At the age of 4, after suffering a minor childhood illness, the son of her neighbor, Dr. Robert Faulkner, insisted on treating her, forcing her to swallow an untold amount of calomel, or mercury chloride, in addition to aquafortis, a highly concentrated nitric acid. Story indicates that after she was visibly harmed by the medication, her teeth falling out, her face turning black, her mouth and gums mortifying, and her jawbone giving away, Dr. Faulkner tried to euthanize her with arsenic. But her parents, suspecting his murderous intent, motivated by the desire to hide his malpractice, did not give her the medicine he prescribed. Her father, and this is what there's no photographs of her, but this is a photograph of someone who had similar treatment a few decades later. And we think that she might have had these this sort of deformities of the face. However, Dr. Faulkner fled the area and no money was received by her family. Her father died when Elizabeth was about 10, and when she reached adulthood, she fought the legal, medical, and church establishment for decades in an effort to secure these funds to cover, for instance, the cost involved in more than 20 surgeries she endured. In her autobiography, she explains that her efforts eventually proved unsuccessful because, as she declares, injustice is often done to the poor, and more especially to the women of that class who are more defenseless because their sex and poverty make it more difficult to access the help of those who should be their natural protectors. Before turning to print and sharing her story, which we are told on the title page is a truth stranger than fiction, Story tried every possible avenue to secure the funds from Faulkner. Despite her disfigurement and the disabilities it caused, and her status in Victorian Scotland as an incurable, Story worked as much as possible as a seamstress, dressmaker, and milliner, a hat maker, when she was healthy enough. In this way, she persuaded others that she was an industrious member of society, one of the deserving poor, and with family support, it also prevented her institutionalization. She also secured a series of witnesses and advocates from many walks of life across the classes to attest to her virtuous nature, unblemished character, and the truth of her claims. These included, for instance, manufacturers, merchants, corn factors, weavers, blacksmiths, doctors, lawyers, and church elders. She gained expertise in the policies, practices, and paperwork of the medical, legal, and ecclesiastical fields, and slogged her way through the three systems that these professions operated within, but was repeatedly undermined by Dr. Falconer, her personal minister, and even her own lawyer. The only copy of the original court order awarding the Story family £1,000 mysteriously went missing. In order to continue her lawsuit in the Court of Session, she had to be placed on the poor rolls. However, her name was mysteriously removed from the church's communion roll, probably because church leaders did not want to become involved legally or financially with her ongoing lawsuits. She was denied reinstatement, and when she wouldn't go away and asked the local Kirk leaders to release her records, they refused unless she paid a prohibitive sum they knew she could not afford. The final affront was that she was ordered to pay the legal costs of Dr. Falconer in order to prevent her from continuing the battle for justice. However, if the establishment thought that such legal decisions would silence Elizabeth's story, they were mightily wrong. At the age of 41, she managed to secure 105 subscribers to have her story published in Glasgow by Richard Stobbs, a printer on South Portland Street in 1859. In that work, we see what the French thinker Michel de Certeau might call tactics, or the art of the weak, which are employed against the oppressive strategies of those in power. Story uses these tactics in a sophisticated way to ensure that her experiences and voice are at the very least heard by her contemporaries and those who come after them. She uses at least 4 major tactics in her autobiography: the language of combat, hybrid forms and languages in the Bakhtinian sense, the refusal to be reduced to what was called back then an object by fashioning herself as a complex, active, three-dimensional subject, and the use of all 3 Aristotelian modes of rhetorical appeal: ethos, logos, and pathos. First, Story chronicles her relentless pursuit of justice across time, marking each act of resistance along the way. This pursuit is often figured as a kind of combat or warfare in an unequal war with powerful opponents, to cite her words. She must fight because she, through no fault of her own, is a child of misfortune who was made an object for life. The word object was used in this context to signify something placed before or presented to the eyes or other senses. At this point in her story, she accepts an identity of victimhood, writing, I was depressed by permanent bodily suffering. Oh, I'll go Glaswegian. I was depressed by permanent bodily suffering, deprived of the power of speech, disfigured and disabled in appearance by medical experimental abuse. I'm the victim, doomed to a lifetime of suffering and misery. Her enemy, particular doctors, lawyers, and ministers, are all but her life destroyer, a turncoat or traitor, and a wolf in sheep's clothing, respectively, and are, quote, thoughtless, wanton, inconsiderate, and unfeeling beings by her account. These enemies support her belief that the oppression of the weak by the powerful is a law of nature in unceasing operation. Despite at times feeling despair in the face of this natural law, stories still manage to garner moral, social, and financial support to avoid fighting alone. Friends and collaborators, some moral professionals in the legal, medical, and ecclesiastical fields, testify to her unblemished character and confirm the truth of her statement that she has been reduced to a complete object, this is a quotation, and is almost unfit to do anything. Although at times she operates within the narrative of victimization to justify combat, Story's use of numerous genres and types of discourse help her to provide a more complex vision of her identity. The many genres she includes in her 154-page autobiography include spiritual autobiography, a scandalous expose, a cautionary tale, horror, including the grotesque, letters, legal genres such as petitions, pleas, proofs, dispositions, reclaiming notes, and journalistic genres like abstracts and articles, one she published in the London Journal, a notice she published in the Glasgow Examiner, and copies of handbills she personally posted all over Glasgow. I love Elizabeth's story. Each of these genres have different codes and conventions that provide her with the linguistic ammunition, not only to support her cause, but to move beyond representing herself as an object of doctors. So on the one hand, she can draw on genres that feature the narrative trajectory of a heroic triumph over adversity, evident when she writes the following. Defeat never had the effect of daunting me, like George Stephenson when striving to perfect his locomotive. His many defeats only stirred him up to renewed exertion, till at last he gloriously succeeded. So now every defeat seemed to me just some new opportunity for exerting the little strength I had in the cause of right, hoping that I might succeed and the cause of truth would triumph. On the other hand, however, she does not deny times of suicidal ideation because she feels, quote, doomed to a lifetime of misery. Similarly, she describes the spiritual comfort and consolation that she feels when reading the Bible and remembering its passages. But then she recognizes that her experience at the hands of some ministers might drive, quote, some to a perfect hatred of religion. Therefore, her fusion of genres produces a more authentic three-dimensional vision of a poor disabled woman in Victorian Scotland, instead of simply presenting her as a triumphant hero or a friendless passive victim. We leave the autobiography feeling that she is at once a struggling, suffering yet active agent who masters rhetorical tactics to challenge oppressive medical, legal, and clerical systems and expose their failings. Within this hybrid form, Story also brilliantly balances all three forms of Aristotle's rhetorical appeals. Through factual, faith-based personal testimony, substantiated by myriad reliable witness statements, or ethos, by rational argumentation versus logical modes of thought and discourse, or logos, and the evocation of sympathy that resonates with what's described by Adam Smith, by recounting in detail the nature and sources of her bodily suffering, or pathos. Story initially generates authorial credibility by developing a sense of intimacy with her readers to convince them that her story is genuine and reliable. She is presented on the title page as a persecuted native of Glasgow who speaks on behalf of her fellow citizens. She highlights that she is not only attempting to get justice for herself, but is an activist and advocate who seeks to give a voice and power to others, like Graham Morgan, who's going to speak next, who have been victimized and ignored as insignificant. She thereby presents herself as a representative of the afflicted, who has assumed the role of a servant of the public good, who speaks only the truth. She writes, I don't know if I have this. She writes, I can offer nothing attractive to the reader of this book except the truthfulness of the statements made therein. Certificates and testimony, including those of eyewitnesses from her childhood, are then cited verbatim to prove her credibility. Story then uses logical argumentation, often mimicking legal discourse, to prove that it was Dr. Faulkner who rendered her disfigured and disabled, making, for example, clearly stated premises: that she was healthy before his treatment, and that she was disfigured and disabled immediately after his treatment. Ergo, Dr. Faulkner is the cause of her current condition. Such arguments are again supported by a set of specific observations reproduced by reliable witnesses to both the original event and its aftermath. This strategy demonstrates that Story does not only want her readers to associate her disability with what's called affective or emotional excess. Story's legal argumentation did lead her to receive financial support from her lawyer, Mr. John Kerr, who Story sued for having willfully neglected to recover the original process against Faulkner. However, Story appeals to pathos as well as ethos and logos to encourage a sense of fellow feeling in the reader. She refers to the, quote, pain and torture I have endured under surgical operations to which for more than 20 times I have had to submit. And she recalls the, quote, extract of all of her teeth, the sawing off a piece of her gums, and the removal of a part of her jaw, which had fallen under the chin and hardened there. Elsewhere, she recalls a surgery in which they had to remove a piece of her jaw which lodged in her glands and restricted her breathing for 10 days, causing indescribable pain. The grotesque nature of such accounts would inevitably inspire the sympathy that Adam Smith believes is necessary for the sufficient harmony of society, even if one's compassion can never be exactly the same as the original sorrow of the one who suffers. To strengthen the need to respond to her account with sympathy, Story also includes excerpts from the works of allies which advocate sympathy toward her. For example, the letter of one legal writer in Glasgow is reproduced, in which he calls her a struggling victim for Christian privileges, whose rights were so barbarously withheld, and calling for financial reimbursement to be given to her as a solatium, or compensation, to her injured feelings. In conclusion, in her autobiography, Story is not interested in self-reflection and analysis, but rather in advocating for herself and others who are poor, disabled, and oppressed. She exposes through her life story the inner workings of the legal, medical, and ecclesiastical professions in Scotland, demonstrating how they jointly operate to deny her and those like her due process and justice. While she teaches her readers how the existing power structures reproduce and reinforce themselves, she also underscores her belief that one poor disabled Glaswegian woman can reform such monumental institutions, writing that the facts which will be brought to light may also serve to warn those in higher power of the danger of doing injustice or injury to any. Trusting through the insignificance of their victims, the world would never know how much they have made others to suffer. Story refused to be a silent and passive, insignificant object, and spoke the truth loudly and unabashedly by any means possible, encouraging others to do likewise by setting forth the extra-textual and textual tactics necessary to resist discrimination based on class, gender, and disability. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Holly. That was absolutely amazing. I look forward to discussing that, and thanks to you and Dana as well. That was just amazing. Thank you. And yeah, now I will introduce our next speaker, Graham Morgan, who will present on how activism informs mental illness in memoir, and we will hear about for those of you who have met Start, read his work, Start, including Start. That would be a real treat to hear from Graham about the process. But so in terms of Graham's bio, he lives in Argyll with his partner Wendy, her children, Dash the dog, and the rabbits. He has a diagnosis of schizophrenia and has been treated compulsorily for this over the last 16 years. He uses this experience in his work and activism to raise awareness and seek social justice for the community he sees himself as a part of. He incorporates this into his memoir Start and Blackbird Singing, which we will talk about at this event. He was awarded an MBE for his work in the world of mental health in 2012. So thanks so much, Graham. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I've got no PowerPoints or anything. I'm just going to read from the script, but we'll see how we get on. I'm assuming you can all hear me okay.
Yes.
Yes, good.
Yes.
So I'll start off traditionally with a hello, and it's good to be here. I'm going to talk about how, and to some extent, why I've written about my disability in my memoirs Start and Blackbird Singing, and we'll try as far as I can to relate it to some of the wider debates about disability. My name's Graham Morgan. I have a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and have been treated against my will in the community for the last 16 years. I'm 63 years old and was first admitted to mental health services when I was 17 and first admitted to hospital when I was about 20. The hospital I was admitted to first was one of the old asylums, and in those days, although it was already closing down, still had about 1,000 patients. The place lived up to the image of the old asylums, and I could rightly say how awful it was, and how my experience there set me on the path of trying to create a world which was more just for me and my peers. But there were elements to it that I remember fondly, such as going to the pub in the evenings with the nurses who were looking after us, or the general air of anarchy to our treatment. Anarchy and corporate institutions are poor bedfellows, but I treasured the spirit of the nurses I met there and their ability to let their humanity shine through into our lives, despite the rules and regulations. It may be good that we now have rules that guard against abuse and exploitation, but my ideal is to have a system that works so well that the workers who are part of it can love their job and love the people they work with, and when life is awful and we're dealt with against our will, do it with love in their hearts. When I left that hospital, I pretty much abandoned my education and started speaking out with my friends and peers. We created one of the first drop-in centres run by young people with a mental illness for other young people with a mental illness. And such was our idealism and maybe anger, we refused to let professionals on the premises without our express permission. It was not much later that I left England and joined a group campaigning for a better world for people like me in Scotland. And not too long after that I got a job trying to create groups that would speak out for those of us with a mental illness. In those days I was idealistic and lived an almost political life where many of our views were shaped by the radical social workers and community development workers in our lives. We wanted to make our own decisions and have a voice in all that happened to us, and viewed most professionals and policymakers with deep suspicion. It was around this time that ideas of mad pride began to surface, and alongside it the creation of Glad to be Mad t-shirts, and groups that ran their own services, and other groups that tried to have a voice in their own lives, and act as a counter to those who might take decisions for us. I've worked alongside people with a mental illness ever since, trying to create a different, better, kinder world. I left Edinburgh and spent 20 years in the Highlands, where we create groups that spoke up for our community. As we grew, we developed subgroups, such as one for parents whose children had been taken into care. We went into the local prison, we worked with migrant communities, we developed a vibrant young people's group, and were represented on the committees that created our mental health legislation. We went into schools and appeared in the media and wrote report after report expressing our collective opinions, as well as linking up with other groups across the country, within Europe and further afield. However, the Highlands created a new understanding for me. Before, I had mainly been motivated by anger, but increasingly I met people who wanted to speak out because they wanted to give back in thanks, or wanted to comment on all the ways in which services could help and which they were sometimes prevented from accessing, but would very much like to get. This was especially the case with our old hospital, which was closing and whose future we were commenting on. To my huge surprise, most people I met had some affection for the hospital and were delighted that it was sited on the edge of town, away from the general population. This awakening made me reevaluate those glad to be mad t-shirts. By then I knew fine what it was like to be sectioned and to be close to death because of an illness I still struggle to acknowledge I have. I looked around my friends and those who used to be my friends and realized I could no longer reliably count the number of people I knew who had died by suicide. Some had undoubtedly died because of an unkind and discriminatory society and unhelpful support, but the majority seemed to have died because mental illness, when you're stuck in it, is horrendous. I listened to the statistics a bit more and found out that people with my diagnosis find their experience so awful that 1 in 10 of us kill ourselves rather than live with it anymore. At that point, I stopped saying I was glad to be mad and instead began to talk about the reality so many of us experience. The social model of disability had its attractions when we thought of the way society viewed us and basic accommodations that could make our lives better. But when I remembered my times in hospital when I was sure I was toxic and poisoning the world and all those I loved, and was so distressed by this that I did everything possible I could kill myself and harm myself, I couldn't think how society was responsible for that, or how it could adjust to enable me to live without taking control of my safety and treating me in the hope that the worst of these thoughts would gradually fade away. It was also around this time that I found that the universal acceptance of the social model of disability was being questioned in relation to mental illness, and was being replaced by rights-based models, which emphasized our rights but also recognized that some of these rights were a right to life and a right to the best possible health care, which some of us seemed determined to throw away when our normal ways of making decisions were overcome by illness. It was also at this time that I started writing my memoirs. I had been gathering the views of my peers for years, and now, maybe selfishly, I wanted a chance to say how I felt and what I had experienced, rather than reflect the experience of my friends. I wanted to say this away from models of how we should be viewed or how we should be treated, away from policy and ethics and ideology, and much more in a place of honesty, divorced from how some people might prefer me to shape my narrative. For me, that was a liberation. Sometimes, when, like me, you've spent decades telling your story and others' story, using your own life to make points and shift the narrative about how people like me are viewed, you can become alienated from yourself. You can become keen to project a certain image that will lead to change in attitudes, or you can try to make points about your life or your peers' lives to try to shift policy in recognition of the reality of what we're going through. But in some ways, this can become artificial, and in some ways, the pressure to cooperate and support each other in a communal cause seemed to almost alienate my own self from my own life. In many ways, I had lost grasp of my own story. The memoir was a chance to correct that, a chance to ask who I really was and what I really thought, while removing an obligation to check and verify my story with my peers. Initially, my story was a dark one. I had recently left my wife, and in doing so, had found to my shock and ultimately to my deepest despair that this seemed to mean I had also left my son. I had spent 4 months in hospital on a section and had been released on a section into the community, and it seemed I would remain on it indefinitely. I wanted to tell my story, and I wanted to bring to light the reality of life for someone with my diagnosis. I wanted to highlight loneliness and suicide and discrimination, but also that wide breadth of my life that was not necessarily about mental illness at all. My first attempt was far too intense and far too sad. It dealt with what it's like to be watched going to the toilet with nurses watching, or having to sleep for weeks at a time with the light on in my room 24 hours a day, or what a ward felt like when many of the patients were crying when we found out that one of our fellow patients had just killed themselves. It talked of self-harm and drinking too much and the cataclysm that leaving my wife turned out to be. I can't say I told a totally open account of my life because I think as soon as we tell our story, we try to pass on a perception and the history we're happy to let others hear. But I tried to be as open and as honest as I know how to be. It's now a bit of a cliche to repeat this, but like many people, I did not want to be inspirational or tragic. I just wanted to be a fairly old, fairly messy man, sat down with strangers to tell a story of illness and family and nature, and walks on the beach and learning how to make friends for the first time in my life, and learning along the way how to reflect on my life. At the same time as I started this memoir, I became close to Wendy, who I now live with, and the story of falling in love gave a lightness to the sadness of despair. In the end, the book followed a pattern of one chapter about my life with mental illness and my reflections on it, followed by another chapter about falling in love, about being in the Highlands or Argyll, and regaining contact with my parents' and brother and sister's families, who to some extent I had become estranged from. When I look back on that first book, I now tend to see it as being much more a love story than a tale of illness or disability. It's not about a book about recovery, and it does not have happy endings. The book ends with me losing my latest tribunal about my compulsory treatment and still wanting to die, and getting bad news about my physical health. In other words, muddling through like we all do, but in my case with the bonus of new community and love and family and friendship. To me, that was very important. Too many of my friends have little hope of a better life, and too many get fed up with sanitized, smiley images of people like them being provided in an attempt to change attitudes. And too many feel let down by relentless attempts to show people recovering from adversity when they know they won't. I wanted to show life where illness and disability remain pretty much a constant, a life which can be wonderful and equally can be harsh and bitter. My next memoir, Blackbird Singing, follows a similar format. Ostensibly, it was about the death of my dad and Wendy's dad and how that affected us. But again, the chapters were split. A mental health one, a Wendy and family and loved one, and another one about our parents. Some people tell me it's a very good book, just as they tell me Start is. But Start, mainly maybe because I put so much of my heart into it, remains the one I feel most affection for. I'm currently finishing another memoir, mainly about my childhood, and mainly about being sent away from home at the age of 9 to boarding school. It's a different book, more a searching for explanation, but also an attempt to show how such places, certainly in the past, were places of cruelty and abuse, which, while being places people with great privilege went to, were also places that savaged the emotional landscape of many of the people who went to them, and which produced some of our current leaders, warped by childhoods from which love and cuddles and kindness stopped at an early age. I also, slightly sadly, write a weekly Substack post, usually on a mental health theme, but also about Dash the dog and my family. Sometimes people comment on what I say, but not very often, and that's lovely. So if you're interested, do follow me there. It's free, and I'm always delighted when I say something that resonates with another person. And that's me having spoken my bit. So I shall stop now and see where we go.
All right, thank you so much, you two, for your wonderful presentations, Holly and Graham. I'm very happy to learn about those wonderful works that you work on. And let's start with Holly. As you spoke about Elizabeth Story's autobiography, we learned that it is not simply a personal memoir of suffering, but it is also, as I understood, a very calculated political and rhetorical intervention that exposes quite clearly these intersecting failures of Victorian medical, legal, but also religious authority. And she also, as you said, transforms her bodily suffering into evidence against this institutional power. She weaponizes her autobiography by combining this emotional first person testimony, but also with so many documents that you mentioned, legal records, medical certificates, petitions, etc. So that was absolutely stunning to learn about. And I just had a question, because if we had to speak about perhaps her legacy, because I think that that was a very striking example at that time, were there any other women that followed her claims afterwards? Was it quite vocal at the time? Were there any authors, writers who decided to fight against this injustice at the time in Victorian society or laterwards? And how, in your opinion, does she inspire disability studies today?
Yeah, so it's very hard to find a woman like her. There were other Scottish late Romantic and Victorian women. I found two others at one point who had disabilities, but they did not really, that wasn't the key aspect of their identities. And none of them were advocates like Elizabeth Story is. But what she did do is she joined, she participated in, they started to create societies. So the Edinburgh kind of Association of Incurables, and they raised money and they set up safer places for people who were designated with the category incurable. And she worked associated with them and worked alongside them when she could. I actually found her last will and testament, and when we were writing the article, and she died with £39, and she gave it all to the Edinburgh sort of Society of Incurables. And I thought that was wonderful that even at the end, every cent she had never married, went back to the advocacy work that they did. But in terms of Scotland, she's and a woman, she's very, very rare. And this refusal to give up and just keep it for decades, arguing, and this strong sense of justice. She's a very distinct kind of personality. But I should say
Yes.
she is part of the broader Victorian uprising, for various groups. In that period, there's a lot of sort of class-based groups also rising up as well.
Yes, I think this is also great because her work really stands out at this intersection of gender, class. Also, we have a very strong particular identity because you have a woman who is also Glaswegian, so you have Scottish identity, minor to, let's say, British, but also Glasgow to Scotland, etc. So that's interesting, and I think all of you too, especially listening to you, love this part that you read in your Glaswegian accent. I think we could also hear her voice. That was, I think, a very powerful, layered interpretation added to the reading of her text. That's great. Thank you for that. I will shortly move to Graham now, and perhaps I think that could also be time to all of you here listening to our both brilliant speakers and think about your questions. So Graham, thank you so much for this great presentation that made us learn to know the person you are and also how you tackled this very personal experience of schizophrenia that you have, that you do not simply reduce that to a mental condition, but you also spoke about those social, political, and especially personal aspects of your experience. And you asked a question, you said at some point that you asked yourself a question, how society could be responsible for the experience of mental illness in general. And my question is, for you, especially that you said as a writer and also as an activist, you're a very busy person working for better care and for better society, I would say. So what would be your vision of a more perhaps responsible and kinder society based on your experience, for instance?
Oh, I didn't expect this question. I shall launch into something. I think just dropping something. I for a time a few years ago I was the vice chair of the Scottish Review into Mental Health Legislation, and I was chairing something called the Coercive Treatment Work Stream. But one of the things that we said would be really good to reduce the forcible treatment of people like me would be a world where we felt a sense of belonging and acceptance and connection and community. And it's idealistic, but so many people I know are desperately isolated and terribly lonely, and their illness causes all sorts of difficulties with communication and relationships. I'm going to do a slight plug for somewhere I go, which I idealistically think should happen in every village. In the town next to me in Helensburgh, there's somewhere called Jean's Bothy, which is a mental health and well-being hub. We need our conventional services. We still need our psychiatrists and our medication and our hospitals and so on. But this place I go to do whatever I want. There's a myriad of activities there. You walk through the door, and although it took me 6 months to get brave enough to walk through the door, nowadays when I walk through the door, I don't have to pretend, I don't have to wear a mask, I am just me. And there I do photography and writing, I eat with people, I go walking, but other people do crafts, or they do yoga, or they do bingo, or they go and play table tennis, or they go and play badminton, or there's so many activities, I can't remember them all. And it's a place where we're together. And it's also a place where we're not, this sounds really bad, your stereotypical community of people with mental illness. Many of the drop-in centres I've visited in the past have been used very successfully and very well by many people who have spent their lives on benefits, and really live lives close to the poverty line or under it. This place includes those people, and they're hugely important in it, but it also includes people who are working and people who go because they are lonely, or because they're older and want something to do and want some feeling of connection, or they're neurodiverse, or they have learning disabilities or whatever. And that mixture makes it really good. And one of the things I really love about it is many of the activities are run by the members themselves. So initially we would have, say, the photography group, and that was run by a person who was paid to do it. And as she did it, she realized that she also has mental health problems. And she said, I don't want to be a part in that way. I want to be a member, and I shall run the photography group as a full member of the group and as an equal rather than as someone coming to deliver a service. So we decide on most of our activities, we decide on a lot of what we do, and are in some ways a democratic organisation which is supported by a fantastic worker, Katrina, but a lot of it depends on our voice and our wishes and our needs and our own skills. And I've always loved that way of finding a new life, of giving to each other and also being able to take from each other, of being able to go there for food when we don't have enough food, or to share our possessions if we don't have the right possessions, or to get welfare rights advice or counselling or whatever. And yes, that's my vision. My vision is I could come up with lots of visions, because a lot of my work when I'm working is about finding out these things. But for me, I would have places like that in every village, not just for someone like me with schizophrenia, but with say a mother who in my village has had a horrible evening and is a single mother, and her baby's been crying all night, and she wants somewhere safe to go where she can talk to someone and relax and get a cup of coffee, and maybe someone will hold her baby for an hour or so. Or someone who is just has been alone for too many days and just wants to speak to someone. Those sort of places, I think, would be lovely.
Yes.
Does that sound any good?
Yeah,
Of
that
course,
sounds
and
wonderful.
I think that's absolutely great because what I understood from your talk and better from your answer is that in so many moments we may be reduced to our diagnosis, and those community centers really redefine the person you are. They no longer make you doubt that you're only confined to this diagnosis, but you can rediscover yourself, and this idea that it's not about creating spaces reserved to a particular mental illness or particular disability, but gathering people together around their distress, around their vulnerability, which is something that we all share. We all share those moments when we need to be supported, when we need to be listened to, and simply we need other people to be present and just to I don't know, simple, just a simple presence. I think it's already a great cure. So thank you for illuminating us on that topic. Right, thank you so much for both of you. And now I would like to open a panel for other questions from other people. Is there anyone who would like to ask question to Holly or Graham?
Ariana's got a question.
Yes, Ariana, please.
But I don't want to abuse my position of being part of the group. So if other people have a question, please go before me. Or if you, yes.
And I have a question for Graham as well, too, after Ariana.
Okay, so thanks. So I'll try to be quick. Thanks so much, Holly, Graham, and for the amazing presentations, and Claudia for the amazing sharing. My question, I think, and maybe it's I'm a bit foggy brain, so if it's unclear, please just tell me. So for Graham, yeah, it was just so wonderful to hear your talk after reading Sartre and your response to Claudia's question. So my question is, I found fascinating how you, in your talk, rendered how often causes, communal causes, and activism that we may be part of, or groups, end up constraining our own narrative. And it was beautiful in the book and in your talk where you were saying how writing start helped you find space to really focus on your own experience as opposed to trying to fit other narratives. So, and your your vision that you and the example of that the well-being place really provides a sense of the need for a space where you can just explore your own story. So my question is, out of curiosity, whether you have the response you've had from people involved in various groups, activist groups, or self-advocacy groups. So how have they responded? In terms of how your story has and your kind of rejection of framework that constrain your own story, whether this has resonated and how, and then yes. So how have you navigated and these encounters and also the response you've had? So that's my question for Graham, and for Holly, maybe along similar lines. Similar, it's different, but I wonder about whether how people have responded in terms of other people, maybe other inmates of institutions for incurables or other disabled members, whether you have any record of correspondence or any. Yes, thanks so much.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's gone down well with my peers and my colleagues and my companions. That's been the nicest thing. Some people have said that it expressed things that they've always wanted to hear but have never been able to hear. And some people have said that they wished they had heard or read the book before they became ill. These things have been really, really good. Um, I often give readings in places, and usually it's people with a mental illness who come, and usually there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of warmth and a lot of debate, and it's good. It's good. I really enjoy it. However, the world of mental health advocacy is a emotive and polarized one too. Um, the question of compulsory treatment causes people to have very strong emotions. I personally think that sometimes, however strange it might seem, being compulsory treatment can save our lives and can stop us also from harming other people and is on rare occasions needed. Other people think that it is the most barbaric thing, and they do have the backing of the Committee of the United Nations Convention for Disabled People, so it's not a minority view, but it has resulted in some extremes. So when I went to the launch of Blackbird Singing in Edinburgh, there was a couple who travelled across the country to heckle me at the
Wow.
launch, and that was quite difficult because they caused such a Stussy, although it managed okay and the launch went okay, that the organisers of the event wanted me and my companions to be escorted out of the best back entrance of the
Wow.
store for our own safety. So it does reveal that although I would love to say my book was unifying and gave room to collaboration and debate, and it has to some extent, for some people it is an offence to them, which is hard to deal with because I write it as feeling a member of a community, and I
Mhm.
suppose some people would feel that I to some extent betray their community.
A- As for story, I haven't yet found any additional writings of story, but that's something that I plan to do. I'll be in Scotland in 2027, and I know all of her. I found all of her addresses and so forth, so I will be looking. But one thing that's very interesting about Story is that her work itself is collaborative. So there's a new and fairly new anthology out. Some people might think of the title as offensive because you know that some of the disabled community are taking back the word crippled. So it's a book called Crypt Narratives. I hope I don't offend you. And in it, they talk about how a lot of people with disabilities actually their works that they write are in a way collaborative to in some extent. So with her, we've got all of the writings of others, her allies that are in there, and that maybe she might have had like worked with someone to talk through the legal language as well. And so I that's one of the things I like about her work that a person with disability doesn't have to be isolated and alone. Like that doesn't take away from the authenticity of your voice, but sometimes these narratives are naturally collaborative, and hers is one of them. I have a question for Graham, if I could ask it. Graham, I once tried to write more creatively, and and but I hadn't written in a non-academic way before. But when I tried, all the trauma came up, and it's so distant from how I think in my conscious mind that I was so horrified that I've never written. I stopped writing and never wrote again. In that way, what did you do with all that stuff? Like as it was coming up, how did you process it?
Oh, I think I first encountered that when I gave public speeches, and
Oh,
this is going back decades. This is a sort of amusing story. The first speech I ever gave was in a hotel, and it was so long ago that people were smoking in the conference. So I sat at the stage. I was all prepared to speak. I shifted the chair and it fell off the back of the stage, and I nearly fell off the back of the
Oh
stage with it.
no. Oh
So
no.
I gave my speech and then rushed out the hall and smoked almost a whole pack of cigarettes before I was ready to go back in. But yes, when I first started writing, I suppose for myself and giving speeches sometimes was really hard. There were some times when I talked about my son and how my illness has affected them that when I'm speaking publicly, my eyes become so blurry I can't reach the page. And speaking horribly, that was really good for the audience because it moved them hugely, but it was
Oh,
horrible for me. And
yes.
gradually that pain has gone by. But when I first started writing, I was given a week at Moniach Moor, the writing centre,
Oh,
and that was similar to how you describe it. It was like constant trauma. I would write and I would cry, and I would write and I would cry, and I
oh,
wondered what on earth I was doing.
oh,
And it's just by carrying on writing, and I suppose
oh.
by places like Moniach Moor, who have guided people like me and others who are just learning to write,
Mhm.
how not how to do it, but how to enter into it and how to celebrate it to an extent and how
Mm,
to share some of our sorrows together, which has really helped.
mm,
And I suppose, although I always felt terrified of reading things out, it was reading out in company with people who had also been through similar things, where
uh,
you gained a sense of something, a sense of comfort and a sense of liberation too, I think. So
yeah.
I'm not really answering your question, but I
Yeah, that
found
answers it.
over
That's
time
okay.
it helped. Yeah.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. Sharon Alcor's got one question.
Can I ask a question of Holly? In the 10 minutes or a half an hour actually before I came to this workshop, I was going through the very exciting Waterloo Dictionary of Scottish Periodicals, and which is actually not exciting at all. But I was coming in this dictionary, there was a whole bunch of societies who was publishing newsletters in the 18th and 19th centuries, mostly 19th, and some of them were societies that were for helping the poor or helping people with disabilities, except that, as you said in your talk, worthy, they kept bringing up worthy,
Mhm.
like the worthy poor, or they didn't use the word disabled. I can't remember what they used. What was the word you said? It started with U. I can't remember.
Oh,
Um,
incurables.
Incurable. That was an I. Yeah, incurable. So they would have these societies all seem to have newsletters, but they always have worthy. And did you come across any other writings talking about what made one worthy versus unworthy and how you would prove yourself worthy?
Mostly the two sort of worthiness that you were supposed to have is one, your economic value. If you can't get, you're not involved in paid work, then you're seen in this period as a drain on society. And so that all of a sudden so this is why it was very important for Story to keep on working. And she would feel hellish. I mean, nightmare. I mean, she's got things, pieces of bone stuck in her glands, and she's making hats and sewing. And so any time that she felt she could do paid work, she did it. In order, otherwise she would. And the second one is spiritually. She needed people in a church. So she's got letters from her minister saying that she attend when she was taken off the communion roll, that was terrifying to her in multiple levels. So she had to find another church so she could be back on the communion roll and have testimony that she's a worthy spiritual person. And she even includes a conversion narrative, which is interesting, just to prove she's not just a nominal Christian, she's a practicing Christian. So those, it seems like the two of the ways that you proved yourself worthy in the Victorian sort of England.
Thank you.
Graham's got a question, I think.
It's just a comment for you, Holly.
Oh yes.
And this is not at all helpful, but a few years ago I remember there was a researcher in Glasgow University who was collecting the magazines of patients who had been in some of
Oh,
the psychiatric hospitals. And all I can remember, it was Glasgow University, and they were really interesting. And It was about 4 or 5 years ago, and if I'm really, really good, I'll try to find out her name, but at the moment I don't know it.
Oh, I'd love to. If it comes back to you, that would be very helpful. And you too, Sharon, that that leads society magazines as well.
Oh yeah,
Because
yeah.
yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
No, I was looking at that for another project that we're working on about people who were transported to Australia.
Yes.
But I'll keep a lookout for other works on people who engage with disability.
Yeah. Oh, I see a question here from. Do you see the question, Claudia? From
I can't
Struan?
see the. Oh,
Struan's
yes,
got a question.
Struan. Yes, can you
Hello.
please ask question?
Hello, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
You're very,
Fabulous.
very Scottish looking. Look at you.
Well,
Yeah.
off a shortbread tin. No, I mean, really fabulous talks, Holly and Graham, really, really engaging, and possibly a question that goes to both of your topics, actually. So I was struck just earlier with the presence of the Kirk so formally within the sort of medical structure and that kind of moral economy of formalizing that and ensuring that you are not just a good Christian, but sort of a good decent individual, which makes you worth treating almost, because there's no point treating you if you're just going to be dastardly and criminal. But I was struck, Graham, actually, if there's any copy with a similar phenomenon, your own experience of a similar moral economy for those seeking treatment, if there is a kind of metric that's still imposed, and I dare say it's probably changed. I mean, the Kirk has diminished considerably as kind of institutional thing, but if the nature of kind of medical treatment now has become depersonalized to an extent that, in some regards, that no longer has the same cachet.
I think it still exists. I think it's more in politics. Those of you in this country will be aware of the huge debate around benefits and welfare for people with a mental illness.
Yes.
And increasingly, it seems that people are being told they have meaningless or petty illnesses which don't justify welfare or benefits, and that they should all be working. Which, from my perspective, being among a community of people, I know full well that anxiety and depression can be utterly disabling and stop you working.
Yeah.
And I do very much dislike the rhetoric that are coming from all the parties, really, maybe not all the parties, but a lot of them, to say you should be in work and you should be justifying your existence to some extent. I think there are hangovers of religion. In Start, I mentioned someone, this is now 10 years ago, who was lovely, a young man who was a cook, and he was very anxious and would come in and out of groups and was very much welcomed, but would panic after a time and have to go back to his room. And one of the things was that he was gay, and he was also a member of either an evangelical church or the Free Church, and he couldn't reconcile his sexuality with the teachings of his religion. And unfortunately, about 4 weeks after he was discharged, he killed himself. And so I think some of these things still exist. And in some cultures, there are still some very difficult perceptions around mental illness. I don't see it so much in Scotland, but sometimes when I look at American rhetoric, and I do see it from a very much of an outside perspective, I do worry about the bitterness with which people talk about people with mental illness, like all this stuff about the mentally ill coming to invade upstanding society is not very nice. And to be controversial, there's been a huge amount of publicity about someone called Callaghan who carried out some murders in Nottingham, and that was horrendous, and what his family went through was horrendous. But some of the rhetoric of the people in the media about that and about people not taking responsibility for taking their medication or not taking responsibility for their treatment is, in their case, I think, misguided and wrong. I have no problem with families feeling that. Of course, you would feel that. But if you're a commentator, you should know how complex the idea of taking medication, especially medication that can have huge side effects in a society where you may feel alienated. And because you've been compulsory treated, maybe justifiably alienated from those that help you. That's hard. And certainly for me, I become very wary nowadays when I meet people and they ask about my life. I worry that people will shun me if I say I'm schizophrenic, and not only am I schizophrenic, but I'm given medication and I refuse to take it except by legal remedy. It makes me feel like someone as awful as he was, and I don't know anything about him. I assume he was ill and something tragic has happened to him, which has caused him to create unutterable tragedy to other people. But that demonization is very difficult to deal with, and I think is becoming more and more extreme, not so much in psychiatry so much and the medical profession, but within society and our culture and in the politicians who pronounce on our lives. Does that make sense? And does it sound at all realistic?
No, I absolutely agree. I think that sounds. I mean, obviously you've got the lived experience, so I'm certainly not going to say ours. I thought it was interesting you raised the chap who's in the news, because I was reading about it and it struck me actually while you were talking, especially with Holly's topic, that in some ways, I mean, again, you'll have the better informed opinion on this than I will, but we seem to be caught in a system that can't make up its mind if it wants to be cruel or kind. In that one of the problems was that they, and this is based on a very shallow reading of the news, but they found the diagnosis, but then were unwilling to either take the step to sequester him or let him go entirely, and seem to have put the responsibility directly into his hands, despite the fact they had assessed him not necessarily capable of making the decision, and then not informing his family or his social workers effectively. Do you think there's a... Oh, sorry, Graham.
Sorry, I think it reveals a terrible lack of investment in mental health services over the last few decades. Yeah. I think his case signals the lack of the use of assertive outreach, which used to be quite common, and the lack of resources. And because it is so toxic and difficult to get help, the willingness of people to leave mental health services completely alone. And there will probably be debate which is justified around the use of the Mental Health Act. I think I've struggled with it for many years and I don't have the answers at all. But there is the need for autonomy for people. Like if I was carted off to hospital because I want a section and so on, that would be horrible. That would mean I would lose my job and I would lose my family and I would lose all the things I love in my life, and would probably be completely unnecessary. But some people might think that's justified. And equally, leaving someone free to kill someone unsupported and without services that follow him up is just as terrible. And I don't know how you create that balance. I spent 3 years trying to argue on those points, and I'm not going to get into the debate just now, but I'm very happy to outside of this, because it is hugely difficult to work out what is the right thing. I alluded to rights in my talk, and I think many of the people who I was telling you who were heckling me, who were saying I shouldn't have spoken, they are the people who say you should never ever have forcible treatment. And I think that's misguided. But it's quite easy to understand how you might feel like that. If you don't feel that you're ill and you have been restrained and maybe forcibly injected and kept in a hospital room until someone says you're free to go, and you still don't think you were ill or had done anything wrong, then some people are going to feel highly upset with the system. And whether that's right or wrong or not, it leads to thinking about how do we deal with people, and going back to that thing about how do we feel a sense of belonging and connection if we're alienated. So it gets into all sorts of things. And now I'm wittering, so I'm going to stop. But I hope that gave some illumination.
No, thank you very much, Graham. It's tremendous to have you for such wonderful insight into quite difficult matters as well.
And Graham, are your books? I just purchased your book, your first one, so I can get started, and then I'll get the rest. But are your books available in North America and the UK and?
I believe so. They were originally published by Fledgling Press.
Okay.
And then, unfortunately, Fledgling Press gave up, basically because the director retired. So they're now published by Geilston Press, and the easiest way really is to get them through Amazon, which is a bit embarrassing, but that's how you get them. So if you look up Geilston Press and Graham Morgan, you should eventually get to them. They're not a high-selling one, so they're hard to find on Amazon, but I eventually get there when I look. So you should be able to get to them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps a very last question or two last questions. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question in the panel?
John has one here.
Yes, John, please.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both so much. Those are insightful and deeply moving presentations. And very much appreciated them and been appreciating the conversation here as well. And so I'm sort of trying to, this isn't fully formulated because I'm trying to follow on a bit from what Struan was asking there as well. And one thing that it seems that for both of you in your presentations is there's the idea of that was also mentioned of worthiness. And it seems like there's both in Story's case and what you're describing, Graham, that there's there are like tests or proofs that we impose on people to prove are they worthy to be a member of society, of the church, of this particular group. Even Graham, some of in your experiences within the mental health rights community, activism community, where they're saying, well, you have to have certain beliefs about what we're agitating for. And it seems like to some extent it is what Story's advocating for and what sort of you're writing about, Graham, is it sort of flipping the social narrative rather than here's a group and you need to then prove whether you belong in the group, but rather to imagine the society or the church or whatever sort of group we're talking about as, I suppose, assuming belonging in a way, assuming that this person is a part of the community, and then how then do we get you the help you need? How then do we provide the support so that rather than the individual needing to prove their inclusion, it's the group assuming the broad inclusion, I suppose the radical hospitality. Is this sort of coming across
this
clearly?
is what Story, this is what's interesting about Story. She's saying a lot, like 100 years before we now say it. She's almost saying I'm spiritual but not religious. Because for her, like when she's invoking God and she talks about religion, she said we are, because we're children of God, we are all worthy. She just thinks that's obvious. And so she's trying to change the society economically, spiritually, everything, and sort of flip it upside down. The meek shall inherit the earth. So yes, for her, religion already has made us all, we're all made in the image of God. Nobody's more or less. And therefore, the church is what is doing is evil. So
Mhm.
so she is, and I think others at the time against slavery, you know, the abolitionist movement,
Mhm.
that it doesn't matter what ethnicity or race you are, we're all equally worthy. And
Mhm.
so, but then there's this capitalist imperative, and you know, the industrial revolution, and it's constantly your economic unit, or homo economicus, I think I read once, your
Mhm.
value is in being an economic human being. and and the church has been sucked into that. It doesn't want to help story, because it will put them at financial and legal risk.
Mhm.
But then on the other hand, there's some moral people within each of these institutions, like the nurses Graham was talking about at the hospital. There's people in the institution that do represent that goodness, and are willing to stand up and fight for her within all of the institutions. So it does give you some hope. I don't know, Graham, what
Mhm.
you think.
Um, I'm going to be a bit controversial because I can't really justify this, but for me, it's helpful. To me, I think illness can be the most convenient way to define something. I say that because those of us who have been labeled with that condition, like I said, we're not always smiley, we're not always kind. And if you've been through incredibly painful times, you can end up as a very difficult person to be with. I've got two illustrations. One was a close family one where when I was telling my brother that I was delighted I was now able to come off my medication at one stage when I was allowed to, and he was on the phone and he doesn't get angry and he doesn't raise his voice, but that time he did. He shouted down the phone and he said, "Graham, do you not realize that when you're in hospital, the entire family is waiting for that call that says you finally died?" And that's, well, it's not my fault. It's part of who I am. And I'm aware that the people who I love and who love me have been through the most painful times imaginable when they've known I've wanted to die. And on another level, in my work, I often go into secure units where some of the patients have committed crimes that we cannot even speak of. And they tend to be gentle and kind and quiet, usually. And for me, it's much easier to think that it is an illness that has caused them to do something unspeakable than to say this is some moral failing of theirs. I tend to think that in most situations, I find it hard to believe in such a thing as evil. I tend to think there are reasons people do things and there are explanations for the way people do things, and the imposition of a morality on those actions is sort of needed, but can also be the very worst thing you can do to people and can leave them utterly without hope. Um, so for me, it's easier to have that label, that definition, to say that person was ill, and the reason they shouted at you was because they were ill, or the reason they tried to kill themselves, or the reason they smashed up the kitchen was because they were ill, because otherwise it's quite hard to cope with the reasons that we do such things.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. I believe we're nearing the end. So perhaps, Ariana, would you like to say something from your behalf?
Yes, just thanks so much, Graham and Holly and everyone, and Claudia for great sharing, and thanks everyone
Thank
for
you.
coming. We are finalizing the details of the next session, but we will share those through IASL as soon as we have those, and we are trying to aim for one session per month. So roughly this is how regularly we are going to meet. But yeah, please stay in touch, and yeah, be looking forward to meeting you again soon. And thanks again, Graham and Holly. and Claudia and everyone for this wonderful discussion. And please take care of yourself, and thanks so much again.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you,
Bye.
Holly, Graham, Ariana, for this wonderful first session that we have. Looking forward to other sessions, upcoming sessions. So I'll be very happy to stay in touch and to participate in those events. And all of you, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Bye, Andrew.